Hey everyone, my name is Justina Ireland, and this is going to be our first class. This is crafting characters. Now, just want to kind of level set some expectations. These classes are going to be very basic classes. We're just talking about, if this is your first time trying to write a story or setting out on some a storytelling journey, this is the bare minimum that you should know. And I also want to add that everybody has a different way of writing their stories. So if you hear, contradictory advice or something that doesn't seem to resonate with you that I say, that's fine. Every writer has their own way of crafting a story, and hopefully part of your journey is going to be finding the way that works for you. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is define who a character is. Who are we talking about when we're talking about characters in our story? And there's two kinds of characters. There's your main character, who, if you remember school and you're beginning English classes, you used to call them the protagonist. It's not really the protagonist or the hero, because you can actually have a main character who is the antagonist in the overall story. That's where we talk about anti-heroes, where you have a bad character who you're following through the story instead of the good guys. Main character is really just the person that the action revolves around the most. They get the most screen time. We follow their journey the closest. You'll see this in writing books and such called the MC. And the thing about the main character is that their character arc should echo the plot arc. What does that mean? It means that when there's a rising action in the plot, a high stakes turning point, this should be your most important decision points for your character. So your main character will have those decision points on the page and on screen, whereas your secondary characters may have just as important decision points, but they won't be on the screen. So the reader won't see those decision points, and they won't follow them as closely as they do with the main character. Your secondary characters are basically everybody else in your story besides your main character. Sometimes people will say, well, I have 3 main characters, I have, 4 main characters. If you have that many main characters, first, congratulations being able to balance those many main characters, because balancing that many, spotlights in one room gets kind of difficult. But second of all, make sure they really are a main character, because part of the thing about secondary characters is they should be just as well developed as your main character. We should see that they have just as much of a character arc of their own and their own story arc, but it doesn't necessarily get page time. For example, if we think about the Hunger Games, the Prim is doing things while Katniss is running back and forth to the Capitol and leading the rebellion. But Prim's character growth doesn't get screen time. We know she trains in Mockingjay. We know she's training to be a medic. We know she's doing these things behind the scene. We just don't see it happen. So she still has her own story going on. It's just we don't see it on screen. And we always talk about page time, and we always talk about, within the lens of the story. So just keep in mind that when you have your secondary characters, they really should have their own arcs or mini plots. So your secondary characters really should have their own arcs, they should have their own mini-plots, but they won't necessarily echo the overall plots. This is where your subplots come in, this is where, you're kind of those boondoggles that don't, if you do play video games, those are your side quests. So just keep that in mind as you're crafting, that those secondary characters have just as much going on as the main character. You just don't have enough page time for everybody to have their story shown. So one of the things I like to do is always give real-world examples, or examples of books that most people have read, to back up some of these ideas. So one of the things we talk about a lot with Katniss is her character growth. And you see that during the Hunger Games, especially the first book, Katniss's character growth echoes that of the games. As the games become more intense, as the stakes become higher and higher, Katniss is forced to make harder decisions. And how she makes the decisions and how she comes to those decisions is part of her character. Does she rush into the decision? Does she consider it carefully? Does she think about the things that people in District 12 are going to think about, how she reacts to situations? This is all part of her character. Peeta is a great secondary character, but he also has his own plot. And one of the great examples of that is how he confesses his quote-unquote love for Katniss during the first interview. and you find out later that this is a plot he had cooked up with Haymitch. So, things are happening off screen, things are happening to the side in other places in the story, but as the reader, we're mostly engaged with Katniss's journey. So when we start talking about characters, we talk about character traits. Now, there's a lot of different ways to describe character traits. I tend to use personalities because I think we've all had that experience of taking like a personality test and people telling you, oh, you're really outgoing or you're very reserved, or, personality I think is a thing we can all relate to. So first thing about personalities, you need to know that the personality of your character will inform your voice. So if you have a character, for example, who is being held back in their high school, who is not the brightest, who is, a really good person, tries really hard but doesn't always succeed, that's going to inform the voice. You probably shouldn't have those $5 words in the dialogue if that's your main character. Also, our personality is going to have a snarkier voice than a kind personality. If you have somebody who's very, kind and loving and, giving, they're probably not going to be the person who quips and mocks everyone, in the conversation. Those two, there's a disconnect there that happens. And personality is really a combination of several traits, and those reveal themselves depending on the scene and situation. How your character reacts to both the setting and to the events of the plot is really going to dictate how their personality are. Are they resilient? Does something bad happen, in the plot and they are able to bounce back easily? Are they angry? Do they respond hastily? These are just things you have to consider and think about as you're going along crafting your character. Because remember, writing is a series of decisions. So it's you making a decision of how those characters are going to act every single time another event in your plot comes up. So here's some just a great, just quick list of personality traits: outgoing, happy, morose, detached, determined, timid, etc. And keep in mind, you can have a character who has very different traits. For example, they may be very outgoing at school, but then, their home life is not so great, so they're very timid there, and you see how that shift happens because of the situation. The best characterization is the ones where it comes through in their word choice and the voice, And one of the easy references, if you watch My Little Pony, you have each of the ponies are very different. Twilight Sparkle is very intellectual, and it comes out in her word choice, and she says very smart things, whereas, Rainbow Dash is, very adventurous, and she runs off into danger and those kinds of things. So just think about how your characters react. That's going to dictate their personality. And some of the that is Divergent, because Divergent, Triss is such a great character because she has very different reactions comparing on her situation. So she at heart is a very eager, risk-taking personality, and that comes in the decisions she makes. She picks to go into a different part of the group, and yet she has this guilt at not choosing abnegation. I can never say that word right. Instead of picking Dauntless. So but you see this over and over again in the story, that she's and even in the follow-on books from the first book, where she's first to make the decision, she's first to jump out there, and she's first to always be in the thick of things. But at the same time, she has a lot of guilt and shame over not being good enough to be, or selfless enough to be abnegation, which informs her character throughout as well. So just keep in mind, those are two kind of very different personalities, but you can have a character that encompasses, very different traits. Keep in mind, though, you have to show those responses early on so that the reader can kind of see how a character would respond. For example, if you have a situation that, is a group situation and the main character is not very outgoing, and you see them retreat into themselves in this group situation, within this group dynamic. But then the next scene is a similar group dynamic, and they're very, they're attacking a person, they're very, aggressive. There needs to be a reason there. The reader needs to be able to make that jump of logic of the character's going to act this way in situation A and this way in situation B. So keep in mind, it's really kind of, it's a lot of just kind of balancing of your character's response to the plot and to their environment. So one of the things I like to keep as a trait is an environment, because you've heard the saying, we're a product of our environment. But this is really kind of like the backstory, like the things that your character has done either within their environment or in a different environment from when they are now is going to inform how they act. So for example, in Hunger Games, Katniss goes from District 12, which is very, very impoverished. There's not a lot in District 12, to the capital. And that informs how she acts in the capital, because she's never seen so much. And there's all this luck, all this food. And one of the things we see constantly is how this humble living in District 12 has shaped her and informed her current personality. So when you're writing your story, for example, if you're writing a story about a mermaid who comes to the main world, how does that environment that the mermaid's always been in, how does that world inform how she acts within the new setting? So environment and past histories very much form your character. A lot of times you see trauma used as as an environment, as a backstory to dictate how a character is, and that's part of it. But more than that, it's who those other people you were around were. Part of the reason Katniss, I keep coming back to Katniss because I think Hunger Games is something most people have seen. How a part of how Katniss acts is because of how she has learned to be a person based on her interactions with other people in District 12. So keep in mind that the environment your character comes from is going to be just as impactful as where they are currently in the story. And again, here's our example, Hunger Games. And Katniss also has an absentee mother. So that actually impacted her ability to trust people quite a bit, because she's had to be very self-sufficient. So she hasn't really learned to, lean on other people. And Peeta, is another example. He comes from the same environment, but he has a different personality, and his experiences have been different from Katniss. So he doesn't necessarily have the same response to events that she does, because he hasn't had that kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of upbringing that Katniss has. So just keep in mind, even people coming from the same environment, depending on their personalities and depending how they are, would have different responses. So another trait I like to call is our fears, because one of the things you see a lot on the page, and a lot of what will drive your character action, is the fear. Like, what is your character afraid of? What do they want the least is really what it comes down to. If it's a middle grade story and you're writing a story about a little girl who wants to, win a pie baking contest, what does she want the least? Well, she would want to lose the pie baking contest the least. This would be her greatest fear, to maybe be embarrassed in front of her friends and to lose this pie baking contest. And characters will do a lot within a story to avoid their fear. They will do a lot of maybe unreasonable things that are still within their personality, but will appear unreasonable to the average reader because of their fear. So, for example, if your main character has a fear of flying, they may, instead of taking a plane, decide to drive somewhere, and it will take them an extra 3 days to get there. So just keep in mind, fears are not necessarily always like afraid of spiders, but sometimes it's just the thing that the main character thinks will hurt them the most. Losing a parent, failing at school, not being accepted into the popular group, whatever that is, that should inform their decisions on the page. And a great example is Divergent. Tris has this fear of letting down her family, her mother and her father, because not only does she pick Dauntless, but she knows that she was never very good at being abnegation. So like you see her constantly war with this idea of being selfless enough and being good enough, balanced with her just personality of being fearless and kind of taking the lead and taking charge. So you see this time and time again. It comes up in the story, like how far she will go to prove to others and to herself that she really is a good person. Of course, the opposite of the opposite of fears are hopes. Hopes are the thing that your character wants beyond all other things. This is the goal for them. It's not always the goal of the story, because sometimes this goal will exist for like a series of books. So for example, on the adult side, there's the Kate Daniels books by Alana Andrews, and Kate Daniels' goal is basically to keep Atlanta safe. It's just a huge goal. She's not going to do it in one book. In fact, what she does is she does it time and time again as the books progress. She's always fighting a new threat to her hometown, just because her overall goal is just to keep Atlanta safe. Like your hope could be to something as lofty as that, save the world, but it could also be something as simple as pass ninth grade. So your hopes don't always have to be these grand do or die kind of things. They can be very small ones. And your character may never get their hope. So it's important to understand that this is not always just going to be the end of the plot, the goal of the plot. It's something completely different. The hope for a character is going to be just something that they informs their personality and their decisions. So for example, if you're writing an adult and your character's hope is to graduate medical school, the scheme of the story might be the main character falling in love with this boy from the wrong side of the tracks, but that main character should still hope to finish medical school. That goal shouldn't go away. And it's really important that the hope drive your character's actions just as much as their fears. Just as much as they will maneuver to avoid their fear, they should maneuver themselves to get closer to their hope, whatever that might be. And a really easy example is Katniss's in Hunger Games. Her greatest hope is to keep her sister safe. She really wants to make sure that she can protect Prim and mostly the people of District 12. We see time and time again she is put in positions where she has to either choose the easy way out, or to keep someone close to her safe, or to keep someone, herself safe, or those kinds of things. So this idea of safety is a recurring storyline within the Hunger Games, especially the entire trilogy, and you see that on the page that Katniss is always trying to keep the people that she loves and that she cares about safe. So that's really her greatest hope, is to keep those around her that she cares about safe. And so something that's not part of your character, but more about how you put those traits on the page, is your reader response. By the end of your story, the reader should understand who your character is and how they would act in any situation. And I mean, not any situation, obviously, we only know ourselves so much, but they should be able to predict with a good degree of and a small degree of error how your character would act. So, for example, in regards to Katniss, we know by the end of the book that she's not really going to eat the berries. She's been watching and if you haven't read The Hunger Games, I'm sorry, I just kind of spoiled it for you. But we know that how she is. We know she's calculating. We know she's smart. We know she notices how the Capitol works, how the people within this story work. So we know that she can predict how other people are going to act, and we know that her own actions are going to be more for tricking the Capitol than actually in the berries and dying. And the difference between a prediction of the behavior and a connection is I can know very little about a person and like them, but it takes time and experience to understand a person. So within the first chapter, your reader should feel a connection. They should find your characters funny or interesting or tragic or whatever you're going for with that character. But by the end of the book, that's when they should understand your character and understand how your character is going to act. And if you have a character who has been acting in a very specific way until about halfway through the book and then they change wildly, that is going to displease your reader, because they expected a certain thing. They expected a little bit of A and a lot of bit of B, and what they got was the reverse. So just keep in mind that there's a reader investment that's going to happen, and part of crafting good characters is making sure that the readers are invested and that they can kind of go along and follow along with who your character is. Not that they have to like them. Liking a character is completely different than understanding a character, knowing a character, or being invested and interested in a character. So I think a lot of times people see as being invested in a character as likable, but it's not. You can be very invested in a character. I watch a lot of Marvel Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and so I was using Agent Ward, or the agent formerly known as Ward, as an example of a great character, because you can tell what Ward's responses are going to be in any situation. Like, Ward is consistent enough that we know how Ward is going to be. However, even within that consistency, there should be some growth. And just to make sure, like, if your character is the same person on page 1 as they are on page 50, that's fine. If they're the same person on page 1 as they are on page 350, there's a character arc issue that needs to be worked out. And so we're going to talk about some intersections. And so the first intersection we're going to talk about is plot and character. And your character is going to inform the plot. The character choices should parallel the action in a pretty natural way. And this is back to that example of as the games increase in the Hunger Games, as the stakes become higher and higher, Katniss is forced to make harder decisions and kind of question her own personality and her own set of ethics in a very meaningful way. And the plot may alter your character. It actually should alter your character. Living through an experience should change a person, either for the better or for the worst. So keep in mind how those different plot events impact your character as you go through your story. If page 1 is them getting a phone call that their parent has died, how does that character look on, page 250 after they find out their dad isn't really dead, or after they've had some time to deal with grief? How do the events of the plot change your character? And your characters should be able to move through your plot, responding in a very real way. If things just keep happening to your character, if it's a scene and they get knocked out and they're unconscious and they wake up and there's the next scene, that's going to be very boring for the reader. The reader wants to see characters respond to these hurdles. We want to see them negotiate, the staircase, negotiate the mountain, so to speak. So, if you throw an event at your character, something like, their father gets cancer and dies, you have to show the reader how they respond to that. As in that response could be anything from, they refuse to acknowledge it and they just keep moving on with their life and eventually they have an emotional break, or it could be that they're very angry. So those responses are very different, but there just has to be some kind of response, and how your character will respond to that is just as important as your character, how your speaks or the word choices that they use. And then character and setting should interact as well. So, for example, your character should have some impact on their environment and on their setting. So if they walk into a room and they don't want to be there, how does that change the setting? What kind of impact do they have to that room? If they are in class and they're sitting in class and they kick over, a chair, what does that do to your setting? What does that do to the classroom environment? So the setting should also impact your characters' personalities, especially when we're talking about your spec fic, your science fiction, and your high fantasy. If your character's in a new world, they need to react to that. They've never been in a world with pink unicorns before. How do I react to these pink unicorns? If your character is moving from, say, New York City to the country, how does that change them? How do they react to that kind of transition? And changing a setting should elicit a reaction. But it should be a reaction within their characterization, right? If you have a very easygoing person and they're filing from New York City to Toledo, Ohio, but not in the city, but like out in the country, like their reaction probably is not going to be they're going to go murder somebody, especially if they've been very, 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 very mild-mannered up until that point. And if that is their reaction, you need to show us that. You need to show us that penchant for violence. Maybe they are one of those people who are very, emotionally turbulent. So, they have a scene earlier before they move where somebody upsets them and they have a very violent reaction that seems completely out of their character, so that the reader knows, okay, this is a person who's very calm and very easygoing until their world is upturned, and then they have a very violent reaction. So just keep that in mind. I mean, honestly, you can do anything with your characters. You can make anything sound reasonable with your character's reactions. You just have to train the reader to expect it. So if you have a character who is, very mild-mannered until, they see blood, you need to show snippets of that before it happens in a big, meaningful way. And I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to think of an example. For example, we're trained to expect that Katniss knows what the berries are in Hunger Games because she sees them earlier, and she tells us that she knows what these berries are and she knows that they're poisonous. So, we see that a couple times so that we know at the end when she holds up the berries that she's really not going to eat them, that she knows they're poisonous. So if that makes sense. And so we're come to the end of our class. So I have some exercises because sometimes it's really hard to understand how things work in the abstract, but seeing them in an exercise can help. So the first exercise is your character is at the grocery store and meets the person they like least in the world. How do they react? So, if you have a character who's very easygoing and they see the person they like most in the world, they might acknowledge them, hey, how's it going? And kind of just move on about their business. If you have a parent character who's very angry, they might, give them the cold shoulder. If you have a person who's very false, they might walk over and pretend to like them even though they hate the person. If you have a character who's very timid, they might hide and duck down another aisle. The reactions are kind of endless. But that's one environment. So take it into another environment. Pretend your characters meeting the person they like the least in a prison. How does that change the interaction? So that's kind of that intersection between setting and character. The setting and the environment you're in are kind of going to change how a person reacts. So then, try a second exercise. Your characters just learn that their greatest fears come true for a close friend. How do they react? They just found out that their friend, happened to be embarrassed at the spring formal. How do they react for their friend being embarrassed? Are they kind of glad it's not them? Is that their personality? Are they really upset and they want to, get revenge on whoever did this to their friend? What kind of reaction do they have? Now change that around. Pretend that their greatest hope comes true for that same friend. How do they react? Are they jealous and pretend they're not jealous? Do they tell their friend that they're jealous? Do they try to put themselves in their friend's position and take their place? There's a lot of different reactions that could happen in those situations. And and just a fun exercise to do is, what kind of ice cream flavor would your main character eat? Why would they eat that flavor? Are they the kind of person who tries the garlic and artichoke flavored ice cream? Are they really just set on vanilla because they've had vanilla their entire life and it's always been their favorite flavor? Just kind of, it's such a silly question, but ice cream choices really do tell a lot about a person. Are they going to stand at a flavor menu for 20 minutes trying to decide because they just can't make up their mind? These are all kinds of exercises, and I'll post some links underneath the class to other places you can get exercises. There's a lot of different character development exercises you can find on the internet. In fact, if you just Google character development exercises, you'll find a bunch of them. Some of them involve, answering 20 questions about your character. Some of them involve, like thinking about different scenarios. If your character, was a detective, like how the crime, those kinds of things. So, there's a lot of stuff you can do with character. I hope I've given you some things to think about while you're crafting your characters. And like I said, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Hey, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.